Cambridge Sketches by Frank Preston Stearns Par3. Dr. Holmes. I have often been inside the old Holmes house in Cambridge. It served as a boarding house during our college days, but afterwards Professor James B. Thayer rented it for a term of years, until it was finally swept away like chaff by President Eliot's broom of reform. The popular notion that it was a quaint-looking old mansion of the 18th century, which seems to have been encouraged by Dr. Holmes himself, is a misconception. It was a 2.5-story, low-studded house, such as were built at the beginning of the last century, with a roof at an angle of 45 degrees and a 2-story L on the right side of the front door. Dr. Holmes says, "Gambrel, Gambrel, let me beg. You will look at a horse's hinder leg. First great angle above the hoof. That is the gambrel, hence gambrel roof." Now, anyone who looks carefully at the picture of the old Holmes house, in Morse's biography of the doctor, will perceive that this was not the style of roof which the house had, at least, in its later years. Dr. Holmes graduated at Harvard in 1829 at the age of 20. His class has been a celebrated one in Boston, and there were certainly some good men in it, especially Benjamin Pierce and James Freeman Clarke, but I think it was Dr. Holmes's class poems that gave it its chief celebrity, which, after all, means that it was a good deal talked about. In one of these he said, "No wonder the tutor can't sleep in his bed with two 29ers over his head." He was said to have composed 29 poems for his class, and then declared that he had reached the proper limit, that it would not be prudent to go beyond the magical number. It was not a dissipated class, but one with a good deal of life in it, much given to late hours and jokes, practical and unpractical. The doctor himself is mysteriously silent concerning his college course, and so are his biographers, but we may surmise that it was not very different in general tenor from Lowell's, although his Yankee shrewdness would seem to have preserved him from serious catastrophes. In The Autocrat of the Breakfast Table, Dr. Holmes mentions an early acquaintance with Margaret Fuller, which is not referred to by Mr. Morse, but must have arisen either at Mrs. Prentice's Boston school or at the Cambridgeport school, which young Oliver afterwards attended. Even at that age he recognized Margaret's intellectual gifts, and he was not a little emulous of her, for he fancied that he had also drawn a small prize in the great literary lottery. He looked into one of her compositions, which was lying on the teacher's desk, and felt quite crestfallen by discovering a word in it which he did not know the meaning of. This word was trite, and it may he suspected that a good many use it without being aware of its proper significance. Margaret Fuller rose to celebrity with the spontaneity of true genius, and left her name high upon the natural bridge of American literature. Holmes did not come before the public until years after her death, and then perhaps it might not have happened but for James Russell Lowell and the Atlantic. He was a bright man, and possessed a peculiar mental quality of his own, but as we think of him now we can hardly call him a genius. He would evidently have liked in his youth to have made a profession of literature, but his verse lacked the charm and universality which made Longfellow popular so readily, nor did he possess the daring spirit of innovation with which Emerson startled and convinced his contemporaries. He first tried the law, and as that did not suit his taste he fell into medicine, but evidently without any natural bent or inclination for the profession. He was fond of the university, and when, after a temporary professorship at Dartmouth, he was appointed lecturer on anatomy at the Harvard Medical School, his friends realized that he had found his right position. Lecturing on anatomy is a routine, but by no means a sinecure. It requires a clearness and accuracy of statement which might be compared to the work of an optician. Some idea of it can be derived from the fact that there may be 8 or 10 points to a human bone, each of which has a name of 8 or 10 syllables, only to be acquired by the hardest study. Dr. Holmes's lecturing manner was incisive and sometimes pungent, like his conversation, but always good-humored and well calculated to make an impression even on the most lymphatic temperaments. While it may be said that others might have done it as well, it is doubtful if he could have been excelled in his own specialty. His ready fund of wit often served to revive the drooping spirits of his audience, and many of his jests have become a kind of legendary lore at the medical school. Most of them, however, were of a too anatomical character to be reproduced in print. So the years rolled over Dr. Holmes's head, living quietly, working steadily, and accumulating a store of proverbial wisdom by the way. In June 1840, he married Amelia Lee Jackson, of Boston, an alliance which brought him into relationship with half the families on Beacon Street, and which may have exercised a determining influence on the future course of his life. Dr. Holmes was always liberally inclined, and ready to welcome such social and political improvements as time might bring, but he never joined any of the liberal or reformatory movements of his time. Certain old friends of Emerson affirmed, when Holmes published his biography of the Concord sage in 1885, that no one else was so much given to jesting as Emerson in his younger days. This may have been true, but it is also undeniable that Emerson himself had changed much during that time, and that the socialistic Emerson of 1840 was largely a different person from the author of Society and Solitude. Holmes had already composed one of the fairest tributes to Emerson's intellectual quality that has yet been written. He seems a winged Franklin, heavenly wise, born to unlock the secrets of the skies. Emerson began his course in direct opposition to the conventional world, but he was the great magnet of the age, and the world could not help being attracted by him. It modified its course, and Emerson also modified his, so that the final reconciliation might take place. Meanwhile Dr. Holmes pursued the even tenor of his way. Concord does not appear to have been attractive to him. He had a brother, John Holmes, who was reputed by his friends to be as witty as the autocrat himself, but who lived a quiet, inconspicuous life. John was an intimate friend of Honorable E.R. Hoare and often went to Concord to visit him, but I never heard of the doctor being seen there, though it may have happened before my time. He does not speak over much of Emerson in his letters, and does not mention Hawthorne, Thoreau, or Alcott, so far as we know, at all. They do not appear to have attracted his attention. We are indebted to Lowell for all that Dr. Holmes has given us. The doctor was 48 when the Atlantic Monthly appeared before the public, and according to his own confession he had long since given up hope of a literary life. We hardly know another instance like it, but so much the better for him. He had no immature efforts of early life to regret, and when the cask once was tapped, the old wine came forth with a fine bouquet. When Phillips and Sampson consulted Lowell in regard to the editorship of the Atlantic, he said at once, "We must get something from Oliver Wendell Holmes." He was Lowell's great discovery and proved to be his best card, a clear, shining light, and not an ignis fatuus. When the autocrat of the breakfast table first appeared, few were in the secret of its authorship, and everybody asked, "Who is this new luminary?" It was exactly what the more intelligent public wanted, and Holmes jumped at once into the position in literature which he has held ever since. Readers were delighted with his wit, surprised at his originality, and impressed by his proverbial wisdom. It was the advent of a sound, healthy intelligence, not unlike that of President Lincoln, which could deal with commonplace subjects in a significant and characteristic manner. The landlady's daughter, the schoolmistress, Little Boston, and the young man called John, are as real and tangible as the dramatis personae in one of Molière's plays. They seem more real to us than many of the distinguished men and women whom we read of in the newspapers. Dr. Holmes is the American Sterne. He did not seek a vehicle for his wit in the oddities and mishaps of English middle-class domestic life, but in the contrasts and incongruities of a Boston boarding house. He informs us at the outset that he much prefers a family with an ancestry, one that has had a judge or a governor in it, with old family portraits, old books, and claw-footed furniture, but if Dr. Holmes had depended on such society for his material, he would hardly have interested the public whom he addressed. One of Goethe's critics complained that the class of persons he had introduced in Wilhelm Meister did not belong to good society, and to this the aristocratic poet replied, "I have often been in society called good, from which I have not been able to obtain an idea for the shortest poem." So it is always, the interesting person is the one who struggles. After the struggle is over, and prosperity commences, the moral ends. Young Corey and his bride go off to Mexico. The lives of families are represented by those of its prominent individuals. The ambitious son of an old and wealthy family makes a new departure from former precedents, thus creating a fresh struggle for himself, and becomes an orator, like Wendell Phillips, or a scientist, like Darwin. In the autocrat we recognize the dingy wallpaper of the dining room, the well-worn furniture, the cracked water pitcher, and the slight aroma of previous repasts, but we soon forget this unattractive background, for the scene is full of genuine human life. The men and women who congregate there appear for what they really are. They wear no mental masks and other disguises like the people we meet at fashionable entertainments, and each acts himself or herself. Boarding houses, sanitariums, and sea voyages are the places to study human nature. When a man is half seasick, the old original Adam shows forth in him through all the wrappings of education, social restraint, imitation, and attempts at self-improvement, with which he has covered it over for so many years. Once on a Cunard steamship I heard an architect from San Francisco tell the story of the hoop snake, which takes its tail in its teeth and rolls over the prairies at a speed equal to any express train. He evidently believed the story himself, and as I looked round on the company I saw that they all believed it, too, excepting Captain Martin, who gave me a sly look from the corner of his eye. Rocked in the cradle of the deep, they had become like children again, and were ready to credit anything that was told in a confident manner. But Dr. Holmes's digressions are infectious. The autocrat of the breakfast table is an irregular panorama of human life without either a definite beginning or end, unless the autocrat's offering himself to the schoolmistress, an incident which only took place on paper, can be considered so, but it is by no means a patchwork. He talks of horse racing, the millwrights, elm trees, Dr. Johnson, the composition of poetry and much else, but these subjects are introduced and treated with an adroitness that amounts to consummate art. He is always at the boarding house, and if his remarks sometimes shoot over the heads of his auditors, this is only because he intends that they should. The first 10 or 15 pages of the autocrat are written in such a cold, formal, and pedantic manner that the wonder is that Lowell should have published it. After that the style suddenly changes and the doctor becomes himself. It is like a convention call which ends in a sympathetic conversation. Dr. Holmes's humor permeates every sentence that he wrote. Even in his most serious moods we meet with it in a peculiar phrase, or the use of some exceptional word. Now and then his wit is very brilliant, lighting up its surroundings like the sudden appearance of a meteor. The essence of humor consists in a contrast which places the object or person compared at a disadvantage. If the contrast is a dignified one we have high comedy, but if the reverse, low comedy. Some of Holmes's comparisons make the reader laugh out aloud. He says that a tedious preacher or lecturer, with an alert listener in the audience, resembles a crow followed by a kingbird, a spectacle which of itself is enough to make one smile, and as for an elevated comparison, what could be more so, unless we were to seek one in the moon? There is a threefold wit in it, but the full force of this can only be appreciated in the original text. Nature commonly sets her own stamp on the face of a humorist. The long-pointed nose of Cervantes is indicative of immeasurable fun, and there have been many similar noses on the faces of less distinguished wits. Dr. Holmes ridiculed phrenology as an attempt to estimate the money in a safe by the knobs on the outside, but he evidently was a believer in physiognomy, and he exemplified this in his own case. His face had a comical expression from boyhood. Its profile reminded one of those prehistoric images which de Cesnola brought from Cyprus. As if he were conscious of this, he asserted his dignity in a more decided manner than a man usually does who is confident of the respect of those about him. Thus he acquired a style of his own, different from that of any other person in Boston. He was not a man to be treated with disrespect or undue familiarity. A medical student named Holyoke once had occasion to call on him, and as soon as he had introduced himself, Dr. Holmes said, "There, me friend, stand there and let me take an observation of you." He then fetched an old book from his library which contained a portrait of Holyoke's grandfather, who had also been a physician. He compared the two faces, saying, "Forehead much the same, nose not so full, mouth rather more feminine, chin not quite so strong, but on the whole a very good likeness, and I have no doubt you will make an excellent doctor. After Holyoake had explained his business, Dr. Holmes finally said, I liked your grandfather, and shall always be glad to see you here. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., was class poet of 1861, an honor which pleased his father very much. Immediately after graduating he went to the war, and came near losing his life at the Battle of Antietam. A rifle ball passed through both lungs, and narrowly missed his heart. Alexander Hamilton died of exactly such a wound in 7 hours, and yet in 3 days Captain Holmes was able to write to his father. The doctor started at once for the seat of war, and met with quite a series of small adventures which he afterwards described in a felicitous article in the Atlantic, called My Hunt After the Captain. His friend, Dr. Henry P. Bowditch, lost his son in the same battle, and when they met at the railway depot Holmes said, I would give my house to have your fortune like mine. In a letter to Motley dated February 3, 1862, he says, I was at a dinner at Parker's the other day where Governor Andrew and Emerson, and various unknown dingy linen friends of progress met to hear Mr. Conway, the not unfamous Unitarian minister of Washington, Virginia born, with 17 Secesh cousins, fathers, and other relatives tell of his late experience at the seat of government. He is an out-and-out immediate emancipationist, believes that is the only way to break the strength of the South, that the black man is the life of the South, that they dread work above all things, and cling to the slave as the drudge that makes life tolerable to them. I do not know if his opinion is worth much. This was a meeting of the Bird Club which Dr. Holmes attended, and the dingy linen friends of progress were such men as Dr. Samuel G. Howe, Governor Washburn, Governor Claflin, Dr. Estes Howe, and Frank B. Sanborn. It has always been a trick of fashionable society, a trick as old as the age of Pericles, to disparage liberalism by accusing it of vulgarity, but we regret to find Dr. Holmes falling into line in this particular. He always speaks of Sumner in his letters with something like a slur, not to Motley, for Motley was Sumner's friend, but to others who might be more sympathetic. This did not, however, prevent him from going to Sumner in 1868 to ask a favor for his second son, who wanted to be private secretary to the senator and learn something of foreign affairs. Sumner granted the request, although he must have been aware that the doctor was not over-friendly to him, but it proved an unfortunate circumstance for Edward J. Holmes, who contracted malaria in Washington, and this finally resulted in an early death. Why is it that members of the medical profession should take an exceptional interest in poisonous reptiles? Professor Reichert and Drive S. Weir Mitchell spent a large portion of their leisure hours for several years in experimenting with the virus of rattlesnakes, and of the Gila monster, without, however, quite exhausting the subject. Dr. Holmes kept a rattlesnake in a cage for a pet, and was accustomed to stir it up with an ox goad. A New York doctor lost his life by fooling with a poisonous snake, and another in Liverpool frightened a whole congregation of scientists with 2 torpid rattlesnakes which suddenly came to life on the president's table. Does it arise from their custom of dealing with deadly poisons, or is it because they officiate as the high priests of mortality? Dr. Holmes's Elsie Venner was one of the offshoots of this peculiar medical interest, and when we think of it in that light the story seems natural enough. The idea of a snaky woman is as old as the fable of Medusa. I read the novel when I was 15, and it made as decided an impression on me as Ivanhoe or Pickwick. I remember especially a proverbial saying of the old doctor who serves as the presiding genius of the plot: he knew the kind of people who are never sick but what they are going to die, and the other kind who never know they are sick until they are dead. If Dr. Holmes had taken this as his text, and written a novel on those lines, he might have created a work of far-reaching importance. He appears to have known very little concerning poisonous reptiles, had never heard of the terrible fer-de-lance, which infests the cane swamps of Brazil, a snake 10 feet in length which strikes without warning and straight as a fencer's thrust. But Elsie Venner and Holmes's second novel, The Guardian Angel, are, to use Lowell's expression on a different subject, as full of wit, gumption and good Yankee sense as there are mosses on an old stone fence. In the autumn of 1865, some Harvard students, radically inclined, obtained possession of a religious society in the college called the Christian Union, revolutionized it and changed its name to the Liberal Fraternity. They then invited Emerson, Henry James, Sr., Dr. Holmes, and Colonel Higginson to deliver lectures in Cambridge under their auspices. This was a pretty bold stroke, but Holmes evidently liked it. He said to the committee that waited upon him, "What is your rank and file? How deep do you go down into the class?" He also promised to lecture, and that he did not was more the fault of the students than his own. He was by no means a radical in religious matters, but he hated small sectarian differences, the substitution of dogma for true religious feeling. In his poem at the Grand Harvard celebration in 1886 he made a special point of this principle. "For nothing burns with such amazing speed as the dry sticks of a religious creed. Creeds are necessary, however, and an enlightened education teaches us not to value them above their true worth." In 1867 Dr. Holmes published a volume of poetry which was generally well received, but was criticized in the nation with needless and unmerciful severity. Reverend Edward Everett Hale and other friends of his had already been attacked in the same periodical, and the doctor thought he knew the man who did it, but whether he was right in his conjecture cannot be affirmed. There can be no doubt that these diatribes were written by a Harvard professor who owned a large interest in the nation, and who was obliged to go to Europe the following year in order to escape the odium of an imprudent speech at a public dinner. In this critique Holmes's poetry was summed up under the heading of versified misfortunes, and Holmes himself wrote to Mrs. Stowe that the object of the writer was evidently to injure at any rate, and to wound if possible. It was certainly contemptible to treat a man like Dr. Holmes in this manner, one so universally kind to others, and whose work was always, at least, above mediocrity. He behaved in a dignified manner in regard to it, and he made no attempt at self-justification, although the wound was evidently long in healing. What recourse has a man who places himself before the public against the envenomed shafts of an invisible adversary? Of this at least we may be satisfied, that whatever is extravagant and overwrought always brings its own reaction in due course, and Dr. Holmes's reputation does not appear to have suffered permanently from this attack. The general public, especially the Republic of Womankind, forms its own opinion, and pays slight attention to literary criticisms of that description. Holmes's poetry rarely rises to eloquence, but neither does it descend to sentimentality. It resembles the man's own life, in which there were no bold endeavors, great feats, or desperate struggles, but it was a life so judicious, healthful, and highly intellectual that we cannot help admiring it. Dorothy Q is perhaps the best of his short poems, as it is the most widely known. The name itself is slightly humorous, but it is a perfect work of art, and the line, "Soft and low is a maiden's yes," has the beautiful hush of a sanctuary in it. A finer verse could not be written. Also for a comic piece nothing equal to the wonderful One Hoshe has appeared since Burns's Tam O'Shanter. It is based on a logical illusion which brings it down to recent times, and the gravity with which the story is narrated makes its impossibility all the more amusing. The building of the chaise is described with a practical accuracy of detail, and yet with a poetical turn to every verse. The hubs of logs from the settlers' ellum. Last of its timber they couldn't sell Never an axe had seen their chips. And the wedges flew from between their lips. Their blunt ends frizzled like celery tips. I believe that even cultivated readers have found more real satisfaction in the One Hoshe than in many a more celebrated lyric. Dr. Holmes lived amid a comparatively narrow circle of friends and acquaintances. He attended the Saturday Club, but Lowell appears to have been the only member of it with whom he was on confidential terms. He was rarely seen or heard of in Longfellow's house. In the winter of 1878 he met Mrs. L. Maria Child for the first time at the Chestnut Street Club. It appears that she did not catch his name when he was introduced to her, and stranger still did not recognize his face. When the doctor inquired concerning her literary occupation she replied that she considered herself too old to drive a quill any longer, and then fortunately added, "Now, there is Dr. Holmes. I think he shows his customary good judgment in retiring from the literary field in proper season. What the doctor thought of this is unknown, but he still continued to write. At the age of 70 his alma mater conferred on Dr. Holmes and Doctor of Laws, and this was followed soon afterwards by Oxford and Cambridge, in England. But why was it not given 10 or 15 years earlier, when Holmes was in his prime? Then it might have been a service and a satisfaction to him, but when a man is 70 such tributes have small value for him. There had been an Atlantic breakfast for Dr. Holmes in Boston, and a Holmes breakfast in New York. He was in the public eye, and by honoring him the university honored itself. So Harvard conferred on Doctor of Laws on General Winfield Scott just before the fatal Battle of Bull Run instead of after his brilliant Mexican campaign. If the degree was not conferred on Holmes for his literary work, what reason could be assigned for it? And if he deserved it on that account, Emerson and Hawthorne certainly deserved it much more. Let us be thankful that no such mischief was contemplated. If honorary degrees are to be given in order to attract attention to a university, or worse still, for the purpose of obtaining legacies, they had better be abolished altogether. During his last visit to England Dr. Holmes was the guest of F. Max Muller at Oxford, and years afterwards Professor Muller wrote to an American correspondent concerning him and others. Froude was a dear friend of mine, related to my wife, so was Kingsley dear soul. Renan used to fetch books for me when we first met at the Bibliothèque Royale. Emerson stayed at my house on his last visit here. But the best of all my American friends was Wendell Holmes. When he left us he said, "I have talked to thousands of people, you are the only one with whom I have had a conversation." We had talked about Greek, Thaumagistica, the world as the Logos, as the thought of God. What a pure soul his was, a real serene highness. This is transcendentalism from the fountainhead, and here Dr. Holmes may fairly be said to have avenged himself on the nation's excoriating critic. Frank W. Bird, and the Bird Club. It is less than 4 miles from Harvard Square to Boston City Hall, a building rather exceptional for its fine architecture among public edifices, but the change in 1865 was like the change from one sphere of human thought and activity to another. In Boston politics was everything, and literature, art, philosophy nothing, or next to nothing. There was mercantile life, of course, and careworn merchants anxiously waiting about the gold board, but there were no tally-ho coaches, there was no golf or polo, and very little yachting. Fashionable society was also at a low ebb, and as Wendell Phillips remarked in 1866, the only parties were boys and girls dancing parties. A large proportion of the finest young men in the city had, like the Lowells, shed their blood for the Republic. The young people danced, but their elders looked grave. At this time the political center of Massachusetts and, to a certain extent of New England, was the Bird Club, which met every Saturday afternoon at Young's Hotel to dine and discuss the affairs of the nation. Its membership counted both senators, the governor, a number of ex-governors and 4 or 5 members of Congress. They were a strong team when they were all harnessed together. Illustration, F. W. Bird. Francis William Bird, the original organizer of the club, was born in Dedham, October 22, 1809, and the only remarkable fact concerning his ancestry would seem to be that his great-grandmother was a Hawthorne, of the same family as Nathaniel Hawthorne, but there was no trace of that strongly marked lineage in his composition. As a boy he was quick at mathematics, but not much of a student, so that he was full 18 years of age before he entered Brown University. His college course also left him in a depleted physical condition, and it was several years later when he commenced the actual labor of life. His father had intended him for the law, but this did not agree with his health, and his physician advised a more active employment. Accordingly we find him in 1835 engaged in the manufacture of paper at East Walpole, an occupation in which he continued until 1892, always suffering from dyspepsia, but always equal to whatever occasion demanded of him. He was a tall, thin, wiry-looking man, with a determined expression, but of kind and friendly manners. He must have been a skillful man of business, for all the great financial storms of the half-century, in which he lived and worked, rolled over him without causing him any serious embarrassment. His note was always good, and his word was as good as his note. He always seemed to have money enough for what he wanted to do. In prosperous times he spent generously, although habitually practicing a kind of stoical severity in regard to his private affairs. He considered luxury the bane of wealth, and continually admonished his children to avoid it. He was an old-fashioned Puritan with liberal and progressive ideas. After his marriage in 1843 to Miss Abigail Frances Newell, of Boston, he built a commodious house in a fine grove of chestnuts on a hillside at East Walpole, and there he brought up his children like Greeks and Amazons. Chestnut woods are commonly infested with hornets, but he directed us boys not to molest them, for he wished them to learn that hornets would not sting unless they were interfered with, an excellent principle in human nature. Mrs. Bird resembled her husband so closely in face and figure, that they might have been mistaken for brother and sister. She was an excellent New England woman of the old style, and well adapted to make her husband comfortable and happy. The connection between manufacturing and politics is a direct and natural one. A man who employs 30 or 40 workmen, and treats them fairly, can easily obtain an election to the legislature without exercising any direct influence over them, but Frank Bird's workmen felt that he had a personal interest in each one of them. He never was troubled with strikes. When hard times came, his employees submitted to a reduction of wages without murmuring, and when business was good they shared again in the general prosperity. As a consequence, Mr. Bird could go to the legislature as often as he desired, and when he changed from the Republican to the Democratic Party, in 1872, they still continued to vote for him, until at the age of 71 he finally retired from public life. On one election day he is said to have called his men together, and to have told them, "You will have 2 hours this afternoon to cast your votes in. The mill will close at 4 o'clock, and I expect every man to vote as I do. Now I am going to vote just as I please, and I hope you will all do the same, but if any one of my men does not vote just as he wants to, and I find it out, I will discharge him tomorrow." One can imagine Abraham Lincoln making a speech like this, on a similar occasion. Frank W. Bird, like J.B. Sargent, of New Haven, was a rare instance of an American manufacturer who believed in free trade. This was one reason why he joined the Democratic Party in 1872. He considered that protection encouraged sleazy and fraudulent work, and placed honest manufacturers at a disadvantage, though he obtained these ideas rather from reading English magazines than from any serious study of his own. He was naturally much more of a Democrat than a Whig, or Federalist, but he opposed the doctrine of state rights, declaring that it was much more responsible for the Civil War than the anti-slavery agitation was. The same political exigency which roused James Russell Lowell also brought Francis William Bird before the public. In company with Charles Francis Adams he attended the Buffalo Convention, in 1848, and helped to nominate Martin Van Buren for the presidency. He was, however, doing more effective work by assisting Elizur Wright in publishing the Chronotype, the most vigorous of all the anti-slavery papers, both with money and writing, and in a written argument there were few who could equal him. He appears to have been the only person at that time who gave Elizur Wright much support and encouragement. In 1850 Bird was elected to the state legislature and worked vigorously for the election of Sumner the ensuing winter. His chief associates during the past 2 years had been Charles Francis Adams, the most distinguished of American diplomats since Benjamin Franklin, John A. Andrew, then a struggling lawyer, and Henry L. Payers, afterwards mayor of Boston. Now a greater name was added to them, for Sumner was not only an eloquent orator, perhaps second to Webster, but he had a worldwide reputation as a legal authority. Adams, however, failed to recognize that like his grandfather he was living in a revolutionary epoch, and after the Kansas struggle commenced he became continually more conservative, if that is the word for it, and finally in his congressional speech in the winter of 1861 he made the fatal statement that personally he would be in favor of permitting the southern states to secede, although he could not see that there was any legal right for it. This acted as a divider between him and his former associates, until in 1876 he found himself again in the same party with Frank W. Bird. During the administration of Governor Banks, that is, between 1857 and 1860, Bird served on the Governor's Council, although generally in opposition to Banks himself. He went as a delegate to the Chicago Convention of 1860, where he voted at first for Seward, and afterwards for Lincoln. From that time forward, until 1880, he was always to be found at the State House, and devoted so much time to public affairs that it is a wonder his business of paper manufacturing did not suffer from it. Yet he always seemed to have plenty of time, and was never so much absorbed in what he was doing but that he could give a cordial greeting to any of his numerous friends. His face would beam with pleasure at the sight of an old acquaintance, and I have known him to dash across the street like a schoolboy in order to intercept a former member of the legislature who was passing by on the other side. Such a man has a good heart. Frank Bird's abilities fitted him for higher positions than he ever occupied, but he was so serviceable in the legislature that all his friends felt that he ought to remain there. He was inexorable in his demand for honest government, and when he rose to speak all the guilty consciences in the House began to tremble. He was the terror of the lobbyist, and of the legislative log roller. This made him many enemies, but he expected it and knew how to meet them. He was especially feared while Andrew was governor, for everyone knew that he had consulted with Andrew before making his motion. He was the governor's man of business. He came to know the character of every politician in the state, what his opinions were, and how far he could be depended on. In this way he also became of great service to Sumner and Wilson, who wished to know what was taking place behind their backs while they were absent at Washington. Sumner did not trouble himself much as to public opinion, but this was of great importance to Wilson, who depended on politics for his daily bread. Both, however, wanted to know the condition of affairs in their own state, and they found that Frank Bird's information was always trustworthy, for he had no ulterior object of his own. Thus he acquired much greater influence in public affairs than most of the members of Congress. When Mr. Baldwin, who represented his district, retired in 1868, Frank Bird became a candidate for the national legislature, but he suffered from the disadvantage of living at the small end of the district, and the prize was carried off by George F. Moore, afterwards United States Senator, but going to Congress in the 70s was not what it had been in the 50s and 60s, when the halls of the Capitol resounded with the most impressive oratory of the 19th century. Frank Bird did not pretend to be an orator. His speeches were frank, methodical, and directly to the point, and very effective with those who could be influenced by reason, without appeals to personal prejudice. He hated flattery in all its forms, and honestly confessed that the temptation of public speakers to cajole their audiences was the one great demon of a democratic government. He liked Wendell Phillips on account of the manly way in which he fought against his audiences, and strove to bring them round to his own opinion. He was as single-minded as Emerson or Lincoln. In November 1862, Emerson said to me, "I came from Springfield the other day in the train with your father's friend, Frank Bird, and I like him very much. I often see his name signed to newspaper letters, and in future I shall always read them." Strangely enough, a few days later I was dining with Mr. Bird and he referred to the same incident. When I informed him that Emerson had also spoken of it, he seemed very much pleased. If anyone paid him a compliment or expressed gratitude for some act of kindness, he would hesitate and become silent for a moment, as if he were reflecting whether he deserved it or not, and then would go on to some other subject. His acts of kindness were almost numberless. He assisted those whom others would not assist, and if he suspected that a small office holder was being tyrannized over, he would take no rest until he had satisfied himself of the truth of the case. In February 1870, he learned that a high official in the Boston post office, who was supported in his position by the governor of the state, was taking advantage of this to levy a blackmail on his subordinates. compelling them to pay him a commission in order to retain their places. Frank Bird was furious with honest indignation. He said, "I will go to Washington and have that man turned out if I have to see Grant himself for it," and so he did. One evening at Walpole, a poor woman came to him in distress, because her only son had been induced to enlist in the Navy, and was already on board a man of war at the Boston Navy Yard. Mr. Bird knew the youth, and was aware that he was very slightly feeble-minded. The vessel would sail in 3 days, and there was no time to be lost. He telegraphed the facts as briefly as possible to Senator Wilson, and in 24 hours received an order to have the widow's son discharged. Then he would not trust the order to the commandant, who might have delayed its execution, but sent it to an agent of his own in the Navy Yard, who saw that the thing was done. Frank Bird's most distinguished achievement in politics was the nomination of Andrew for governor in 1860. Governor Banks was not favorable to Andrew and his friends, and used what influence he possessed for the benefit of Henry L. Dawes. An organization for the nomination of Dawes had already been secretly formed before Frank Bird was acquainted with Banks's retirement from the field. Bird and Henry L. Pierce were at Plymouth when they first heard of it, about the middle of July, and they immediately returned to Boston, started a bureau, opened a subscription list, and with the cooperation of the Bird Club carried the movement through. It would have made a marked difference in public affairs during the war for the Union if Dawes had been governor instead of Andrew. Footnote: Dawes was an excellent man in his way, but during 18 years in the United States Senate he never made an important speech. Frank Bird had this peculiarity, that the more kindly he felt to those who were unfortunate in life, the more antagonistic he seemed to those who were exceptionally prosperous. He appeared to have a sort of spite against handsome men and women, as if nature had been over-partial to them in comparison with others. He was not a pedantic moralist, but at the same time rather exacting in his requirements of others, as he was of himself. The Bird Club was evolved out of the conditions of its times, like a natural growth. Its nucleus was formed in the campaign of 1848, when Bird, Andrew, Henry L. Pierce, and William S. Robinson fell into the habit of dining together and discussing public affairs every Saturday afternoon. It was not long before they were joined by Eliza Wright and Henry Wilson. Sumner came to dine with them, when he was not in Washington, and Drive S.G. Howe came with him. The Kansas excitement brought in George L. Stearns and Frank B. Sanborn, one the president and the other the secretary of the Kansas Aid Society. In 1860 the club had from 30 to 40 members, and during the whole course of its existence it had more than 60 members, but it never had any regular organization. A member could bring a friend with him, and if the friend was liked, Mr. Bird would invite him to come again. No vote ever appears to have been taken. Mr. Bird sat at the head of the table, and if he was late or absent his place would be supplied by George L. Stearns. At his right hand sat Governor Andrew, and either Sumner or Stearns on his left. Dr. Howe and Wilson sat next to them, and were balanced on the opposite side by Sanborn, Governor Washburn, and 2 or 3 members of Congress. However, there was no systematic arrangement of the guests at this feast, although the more important members of the club naturally clustered about Mr. Bird. N.P. Banks never appeared there, either as governor or general, and from this it was argued that he was ambitious to become senator, or it may have been owing to his differences with Bird, while the latter was on the governor's council. In this way the Bird Club became the test of a man's political opinion, and prominent politicians who absented themselves from it were looked upon with more or less distrust. The discussions at the club were frank, manly, and unreserved. Members who talked from the point were likely to be corrected without ceremony, and sometimes received pretty hard knocks. On one occasion General B.F. Butler, who had come into the club soon after his celebrated contraband of war order, was complaining that the New York Republicans had nominated General Francis C. Barlow for Secretary of State, and that General Barlow had not been long enough in the Republican Party to deserve it, when Robinson replied to him that Barlow had been a Republican longer than some of those present, and Frank Bird remarked that he was as good a Republican as any that were going. Butler looked as if he had swallowed a pill. William S. Robinson was at once the wit and scribe of the club, and the only news writer that was permitted to come to the table. He enjoyed the advantage of confidential talk and authentic information, which no other writer of that time possessed, and his letters to the Springfield Republican, extending over a period of 15 years, come next in value to the authentic documents of that important period. They possess the rare merit of a keen impartiality, and though sometimes rather sharp, were never far from the mark. He not only criticized Grant and the political bosses of that time, but his personal friends, Sumner, Wilson, and Frank Bird himself. In 1872 Emerson said to a member of the club, "I do not like William Robinson. His hand is against every man, but it is doubtful if Robinson ever published so hard a criticism of any person, and certainly none so unjust." Emerson, without being aware of it, was strongly influenced by a cabal for the overthrow of Robinson, in which General Butler took a leading hand. Robinson was clerk of the state senate, and could not afford to lose his position. Afterwards, when he did lose it, he fell sick and died. He preferred truth-telling and poverty to a compromising prosperity, and left no one to fill his place. Frank B. Sanborn was for a time editor of the Boston Commonwealth, and afterwards of the Springfield Republican, but he was better known as the efficient secretary of the Board of State Charities, a position to which he was appointed by Governor Andrew, and from which he was unjustly removed by Governor Ames, 20 years later. He was an indefatigable worker, and during that time there was not an almshouse or other institution, public or private, in the state for the benefit of the unfortunate portion of mankind where he was not either feared or respected, a man whose active principle was the conscientious performance of duty. He was also noted for his fidelity to his friends. He cared for the family of John Brown and watched over their interests as if they had been his own family. He made a home for the poet Channing in his old age, and was equally devoted to the Alcotts and others, who could not altogether help themselves. He was himself a charitable institution. Henry Wilson is also worth a passing notice, for the strange resemblance of his life to President Lincoln's, if for no other reason. His name was originally Colbath, and he was reputed to have been born under a barberry bush in one of the green lanes of New Hampshire. The name is an exceptional one, and the family would seem to have been of the same roving Bedouin-like sort as that of Lincoln's ancestors. He began life as a shoemaker, was wholly self-educated, and changed his name to escape from his early associations. He would seem to have absorbed all the virtue in his family for several generations. No sooner had he entered into politics than he was recognized to have a master hand. He rose rapidly to the highest position in the gift of his state, and finally to be vice president. If his health had not given way in 1873, he might even have become president in the place of Hayes, for he was a person whom every man felt that he could trust. His loyalty to Sumner bordered on veneration, and was the finest trait in his character. There was no pretense in Henry Wilson's patriotism. Everyone felt that he would have died for his country. In 1870 General Butler disappeared from the club, to the great relief of Sumner and his immediate friends. He had already shown the cloven foot by attacking the financial credit of the government, and the question was, what would he do next? He had found the club an obstacle to his further advancement in politics, and when in the autumn campaign Wendell Phillips made a series of attacks on the character of the club, and especially on Byrd himself, the hand of Butler was immediately recognized in it, and his plans for the future were easily calculated. It is probable that Phillips supposed he was doing the public a service in this, but the methods he pursued were not much to his credit. Phillips learned that the president of the Hartford and Erie Railroad had recently given Mr. Byrd an Alderney bull calf, and as he could not find anything else against Byrd's character, he made the most of this. He spoke of it as of the nature of a legislative bribe, and in an oration delivered in the Boston Music Hall he called it $1,000 in blood. Who, he asked of his audience, would think of exchanging a bird for a bull? This was unfortunate for the calf, which lost its life in consequence, but it was not worth more than $10. and the contrast between the respective reputations of General Butler and Mr. Byrd made Wendell Phillips appear in rather a ridiculous light. The following year, 1871, as the Byrd Club expected, General Butler made a strong fight for the gubernatorial nomination, and the club opposed him in a solid body. Sanborn at this time was editing the Springfield Republican, and he exposed Butler's past political course in an unsparing manner. Butler made speeches in all the cities and larger towns of the state, and when he came to Springfield he singled out Sanborn, whom he recognized in the audience, for a direct personal attack. Sanborn rose to reply to him, and the contrast between the two men was like that between Lincoln and Douglas, Sanborn 6 feet 4 inches in height, and Butler much shorter, but very thick-set. The altercation became a warm one, and Butler must have been very angry, for he grew red in the face and danced about the platform as if the boards were hot under his feet. The audience greeted both speakers with applause and hisses. It was a decided advantage for General Butler that there were 3 other candidates in the field, but both Sumner and Wilson brought their influence to bear against him, and this, with Sanborn's telling editorials, would seem to have decided his defeat, for when the final struggle came at the Worcester Convention the vote was a very close one and a small matter might have changed it in his favor. The difference between Sumner and the administration, in 1872, on the San Domingo question accomplished what Phillips and Butler were unable to effect. Frank Byrd and Sumner's more independent friends left the club, which was then dining at Young's Hotel, and seceded to the Parker House, where Sumner joined them not long afterwards. Senator Wilson and the more deep-rooted Republicans formed a new organization called the Massachusetts Club, which still existed in the year 1900. The great days of the Byrd Club were over. With the death of Sumner, in 1874, its political importance came to an end, and although its members continued to meet for 5 or 6 years longer, it ceased to attract public attention. At the age of 80, Frank W. Byrd still directed the financial affairs of his paper business, but he looked back on his life as a wretched failure. No matter how much he accomplished, it seemed to him as nothing compared with what he had wished to do. Would there were more such failures. Sumner. Charles Pinckney Sumner, the father of Charles Sumner, was a man of an essentially voracious nature. He was High Sheriff of Suffolk County, Massachusetts, and when there was a criminal to be executed he always performed the office himself. Once when someone inquired why he did not delegate such a disagreeable task to one of his deputies, he is said to have replied, "Simply because it is disagreeable." It was this elevated sense of moral responsibility which formed the keynote of his son's character. Charles Sumner's mother was Miss Relief Jacobs, a name in which we distinguish at once a mixture of the Hebrew and the Puritan. She belonged in fact to a Christianized Jewish family, but how long since her ancestors became Christianized remains in doubt. Yet it is easy to recognize the Hebrew element in Sumner's nature, the inflexibility of purpose, the absolute self-devotion, and even the prophetic forecast. Sumner was an old Hebrew prophet in the guise of an American statesman. True to his mother's name, he was at once a Puritan and an Israelite in whom there was no guile, for he was wholly exempt from covetousness and other meaner qualities of the Hebrew nature. In such respects Jews and Yankees are much alike. Either they are generous and high-minded, or they are not. Charles was rather a peculiar boy, as great men are apt to be in their youth. He cared little for boyish games, and still less for the bright eyes of the girls. He had remarkably long arms and legs, which were too often in the way of his comrades, and from which he derived the nickname at the Latin school of Gawky Sumner, and it may be well to notice here that there is no better sign for future superiority than for a lad to be ridiculed in this manner, while the wags who invent such sobriquets usually come to no good end. Footnote: more than one such has died the death of an inebriate. There is sufficient evidence, however, that Sumner was well liked both at school and at college. He had his revenge on Declamation Day, for whereas others stumbled through their pieces, he seemed perfectly at home on the platform, his awkwardness disappeared and his performance gave plain indications of the future orator. Wendell Phillips was in the class after him, and they both were excellent speakers. Sumner's early life was not like that of Lincoln, neither was he obliged to split rails for a living, but it was a life of good stoical training nevertheless. Sheriff Sumner had 8 children living at one time, and with the natural desire to give them as good an education as his own, he could not afford to spend much on external elegances. It was not until Charles had become a distinguished lawyer that his mother dispensed with the iron forks and spoons on her dinner table, and this gives a fair idea of their domestic economy. We learn from Pierce's biography that his college expenses did not exceed $200 a year, and this included everything. He entered at Harvard in the class of 1830, a year after Dr. Holmes and a year before Wendell Phillips. Much more is known concerning his college life than that of other distinguished men of that time, and it is highly interesting to recognize the mature man foreshadowed in the youth of 18. He was a good scholar in everything but mathematics, yet, at the same time, he cared little for rank. He was an enthusiastic reader, and sometimes neglected his studies for a book in which he was more deeply interested. He also liked to converse about the books he read, and in this way acquired a reputation for loquacity which never left him as long as he lived. It was sometimes troublesome to his friends, but it was of great advantage to him as a public speaker. He lived a quiet, sober, industrious life in college, attracting comparatively little attention from either his instructors or his fellow students. Yet, he showed the independence of his character by attending a cattle show at Brighton, a proceeding for which he would have been suspended if it had been discovered by the college faculty. There were many foolish, monkeyish restrictions at Harvard in those days, and among them it was not considered decorous for a student to wear a colored vest. He might wear a white vest, but not a buff or a figured one. Sumner preferred a buff vest, and insisted on wearing it. When he was reprimanded for doing so, he defended his course vigorously, and exposed the absurdity of the regulation in such plain terms that the faculty concluded to let him alone for the future. Footnote: in 1860 he still continued to wear a buff vest in summer weather. He was exceedingly fond of the Greek and Latin authors, and quoted from them in his letters at this time, as he did afterwards in his speeches. His college course was not a brilliant one like Everett's and Phillips's, but seems to have been based on a more solid groundwork. It was in the law school that Sumner first distinguished himself. Judge Story, who had left the United States Supreme Bench to become a Harvard professor, was the chief luminary of the school and the finest instructor in law of his time. He soon discovered in Sumner a pupil after his own heart, and in spite of the disparity of their ages they became intimate friends. This is the more significant because Phillips was also in the same class, and the more brilliant scholar of the two, but Judge Story soon discovered that Phillips was studying as a means to an end, while Sumner's interest in the law was like that of a great artist who works from the pure love of his subject. William W. Story, who was a boy at this time, records the fact that Sumner was always pleasant and kind to children. At the age of 24, Charles Sumner was himself appointed an instructor at the law school, and during the 2 following years he edited the reports of Judge Story's decisions in the United States Circuit Courts. It is evident from James Russell Lowell's fable for critics that the personalities of his contemporaries troubled him. He could not see over their heads. In 1837 Sumner went to Europe, and we find from his letters to Judge Story, George S. Hillard, and others, that he had already obtained a vantage ground from which the civilized world lay before him, as all New England does from the top of Mount Washington. He goes into a French law court, and analyzes the procedure of French justice in a letter which has the value of an historical document. He noticed that Napoleon was still spoken of as l'Empereur, although there was a king in France, a fact pregnant with future consequences. He remained in Paris until he was a complete master of the French language, and attended 150 lectures at the university and elsewhere. He enjoyed the grand opera and the acting in French theaters, nor did he neglect to study Italian art. He was making a whole man of himself, and it seemed as if an unconscious instinct was guiding him to his destiny. Fortunate was the old sheriff to have such a son, but Charles Sumner was also fortunate to have had a father who was willing to save and economize for his benefit. Otherwise he might have been a sheriff himself. Judge Story's letters of introduction opened the doors wide to him in England. In the course of 10 months he became acquainted with almost every distinguished person in the United Kingdom. He never asked for introductions, and he never presented himself without one. He was handed from one mansion to another all the way from London to the Scotch Highlands. Only 27 years of age, he was treated on an equality by men 10 to 15 years his senior, and he proved himself equal to their expectations. No American except Lowell has ever made such a favorable impression in England as Sumner, but this happened in Sumner's youth, while Lowell in his earlier visits attracted little attention. It is perfectly true that if he had been the son of an English sheriff this would not have happened, but he encountered the same obstacles in Boston society that he would have done under similar conditions in Great Britain. The doors of Wentworth House and Strachan Park were open to him, but those of Beacon Street were closed, and perhaps it was better for him on the whole that they were. Sumner's letters from Europe are at least as interesting as those written by any other American. Such breadth of vision is not often united with clearness and accuracy of detail. All his letters ought to be published in a volume by themselves. Sumner returned to America the following year and settled himself quietly and soberly to his work as a lawyer. He was not a success, however, as a practitioner in the courts, unless he could plead before a bench of judges. In the common pleas an ordinary pettifogger would often take a case away from him. He could not, if he would, have practiced those seductive arts by which Rufus Choate drew the jury into his net, in spite of their deliberate intentions to the contrary. Yet, Sumner's reputation steadily improved, so that when Longfellow came to live in Cambridge he found Sumner delivering lectures at the Harvard Law School, where he might have remained the rest of his life, if he had been satisfied with a merely routine employment, and the fortunes of the Republic had not decided differently. The attraction between Sumner and Longfellow was immediate and permanent. It was owing more perhaps to the essential purity of their natures, than to mutual sympathy in regard to art and literature, although Longfellow held Sumner's literary judgment in such respect that he rarely published a new poem without first subjecting his work to Sumner's criticism. Those who admired Sumner at this time, for his fine moral and intellectual qualities, had no adequate conception of the far nobler quality which lay concealed in the depths of his nature. Charles Sumner was a hero, one to whom life was nothing in comparison with his duty. It was in the anti-Irish riot of June, 1837, that he first gave evidence of this. Nothing was more hateful to him than race prejudice, and what might be called international Molly-Goodnighty, which he believed was the most frequent cause of war. As soon as Sumner was notified of the disturbance, he hastened to the scene of action, seized on a prominent position, and attempted to address the insurgents, but his pacific words only excited them to greater fury. They charged on him and his little group of supporters, knocked him down and trampled on him. Drive S.G. Howe, who stood nearby, a born fighter, protected Sumner's prostrate body, and finally carried him to a place of safety, although twice his own size. Sumner took his mishap very coolly, and, as soon as he could talk freely, addressed his friends on the evils resulting from race prejudice. This incident may have led Sumner to the choice of a subject for his 4th of July oration in 1845. The title of this address was The True Grandeur of Nations, but its real object was one which Sumner always had at heart, and never relinquished the hope of, namely, the establishment of an international tribunal, which should possess jurisdiction over the differences and quarrels between nations, and so bring warfare forever to an end. The plan is an impracticable one, because the decisions of a court only have validity if it is able to enforce them, and how could the decisions of an international tribunal have value in case the parties concerned decline to accept them? It would only result in waging war in order to prevent war. Yet, of all the 4th of July orations that were delivered in the 19th century, Sumner's and Webster's are the only two that have survived, and The True Grandeur of Nations has recently been published by the London Peace Society as an argument in favor of their philanthropic movement. Sumner was now in the prime of manhood, and a rarely handsome man. He had an heroic figure, 6 feet 2 inches in height, and well proportioned in all respects. His features, too large and heavy in his youth, had become strong and regular, and although he had not acquired that leonine look of reserved power with which he confronted the United States Senate, his expression was frank and fearless. As L. Maria Child, who heard him frequently, said, he seemed to be as much in his place on the platform as a statue on its pedestal. His gestures had not the natural grace of Phillips's or the more studied elegance of Everett, but he atoned for these deficiencies by the manly earnestness of his delivery. He made an impression on the highly cultivated men and women who composed his audience which they always remembered. The question has often been raised by the older abolitionists, why did not Sumner take an earlier interest in the anti-slavery struggle? The answer is twofold. That he did not join the Free Soilers in 1844 was most probably owing to the influence of Judge Story, who had already marked Sumner out for the Supreme Bench, and wished him to concentrate his energies in that direction. His friends, too, at this time Hillard, Felton, Leva, and even Longfellow were either opposed to introducing the slavery question into politics or practically indifferent to it. On the other hand, Sumner never could agree with Garrison's position on this question. He held the Constitution in too great respect to admit that it was an agreement with death and a government with the devil. He believed that the founders of the Constitution were opposed to slavery, and that the expression, persons held to labor, was good evidence of this. One of his finest orations in the Senate was intended to prove this point. Furthermore, he perceived the futility of Garrison's idea, and this was afterwards disproved by the war, that if it were not for the national government the slaves would rise in rebellion and so obtain their freedom. He always asserted that slavery would be abolished under the Constitution or not at all. Like Abraham Lincoln, he waited for his time to come. Charles Sumner was the reply that Massachusetts made to the fugitive slave law, and a telling reply it was. Unlike his legal contemporaries, he recognized the law as a revolutionary act which, unless it was successfully opposed, would strike a death blow at American freedom. He saw that it could only be met by counter-revolution, and he prepared his mind for the consequences. It was only at such a time that so uncompromising a statesman as Sumner could have entered into political life, for the possibility of compromise had passed away with the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, and Sumner's policy of no compromise was the one which brought the slavery question to a successful issue. For 15 years in Congress he held to that policy as faithfully as a planet to its course, and those who differed with him were left in the rear. Sumner's first difference was with his conservative friends, and especially with his law partner, George S. Hillard, a brilliant man in his way, and for an introductory address without a rival in Boston. Hillard was at heart as anti-slavery as Sumner, and his wife had even assisted fugitive slaves, but he was swathed in the bands of fashionable society, and he lacked the courage to break loose from them. He adhered to the Whigs and was relegated to private life. They parted without acrimony, and Sumner never failed to do his former friend a service when he found an opportunity. His difference with Felton was of a more serious kind. Emerson, perhaps, judged Felton too severely a man of ardent temperament who was always in danger of saying more than he intended. Sumner's election to the Senate was a chance in 10,000. It is well known that at first he declined to be a candidate. He did not think he was fitted for the position, and when Caleb Gushing urged him to court the favor of fortune, he said, "I will not leave my chair to become United States Senator." Whatever vanity there might be in the man, he was entirely free from the ambition for power and place. There were several prominent public men at the time who would have given all they owned for the position, but they were set aside for the man who did not want it, the bold jurist who dared to set himself against the veteran statesman of his country. It reads like a Bible tale, or the story of Cincinnatus taken from his plow to become dictator. The gates of his alma mater were now closed to Sumner, not only during his life but even long after that. Such is the fate of revolutionary characters, that they tear asunder old and familiar bonds in order to contract new ties. In Washington he found a broader and more vigorous life, if less cultivated, and the Free Soil leaders with whom he now came in contact in his own state were much more akin to his own nature than Story and Felton and Hillard. Sumner was never popular in Washington, as he had been among the English liberals and Cambridge men of letters, but he was respected on all sides for his fearlessness, his ability, and the veracity of his statements. His previous life now proved a great advantage to him in most respects, but he had become accustomed to dealing and conversing with a certain class of men, and this made it difficult for him to assimilate himself to a wholly different class. Sumner's ardent temperament required constant self-control in this new and trying position, and a man who continually reflects beforehand on his own actions acquires an appearance of greater reserve than a person of really cold nature. Seward had thus far been the leader of the Free Soil and Republican parties, not only before the country at large but in the Senate. It was soon found, however, that Sumner was not only a more effective speaker, but possessed greater resources for debate. Judge Story had noticed long before that facts were so carefully and systematically arranged in Sumner's mind that whatever spring was touched he could always respond to the subject with a full and exact statement. He was like a librarian who could lay his hand on the book he wanted without having to look for it in the catalog, and this upon a scale which seems almost incredible. Webster possessed the same faculty, but united it with a sense of artistic beauty which Sumner could not equal. Sumner, however, was the best orator in Congress at this time, as well as the best legal authority. On all constitutional questions it was felt that he had Judge Story's support behind him. His oration on freedom national, slavery sectional, was a revelation, not only to the opposition, but to his own party. From that time forth, he became the spokesman of his party on all the more important questions. It frequently happens that the essential character of a government changes while its form remains the same. In 1801 France was nominally a republic, but its administration was imperial. In 1853 the United States ceased to be a democracy and became an oligarchy, governed by 30,000 slaveholders until the people reconquered their rights on the field of battle. Accustomed to despotic power in their own states for more than 2 generations, and justifying themselves always by divine right, the slaveholders possessed all the self-confidence, pretension, and arrogance of the old French nobility. They were a self-deluded class of men, of all classes the most difficult to deal with, and Sumner was the Mirabeau who faced them at Washington and who pricked the bubble of their Olympian pretensions by a most pitiless exposure of their true character. Those men had come to believe that the ownership of slaves was equivalent to a patent of nobility, and they were encouraged in this monarchical illusion by the nobility of Europe. In Disraeli's Lothair an English duke is made to say, "I consider an American with large estates in the South a genuine aristocrat." The pretension was ridiculous, and the only way to combat it was to make it appear so. Sumner characterized Butler, of South Carolina, and Douglas, of Illinois, who was their northern man of business, as the Don Quixote and Sancho Panza of an antiquated cause. The satire hit its mark only too exactly, and 2 days later Sumner was assaulted for it in an assassin-like manner, struck on the head from behind while writing at his desk, and left senseless on the floor. Sumner was considered too low in the social scale for the customary challenge to a duel, and there was no court in Washington that would take cognizance of the outrage. The following day, when Wilson made the most eloquent speech of his life in an indignant rebuke to Butler and Brooks, Butler started from his seat to attack him, but was held back by his friends. They might as well have allowed him to go, for Wilson was a man of enormous strength and could easily have handled any Southerner upon the floor. In The Crime Against Kansas there are 2 or 3 sentences which Sumner afterwards expunged, and this shows that he regretted having said them, but it is the greatest of his orations, and Webster's reply to Hayne is the only congressional address with which it can be compared. One is in fact the sequence of the other. Webster's is the flower, and Sumner's the fruit, the former directed against the active principle of sedition, and the latter against its consequences, and both were directed against South Carolina, where the war originated. Sumner's speech has not the finely sculptured character of Webster's, but its architectural structure is grand and impressive. His Baconian division of the various excuses that were made for the Kansas outrages into the apology tyrannical, the apology imbecile, the apology absurd, and the apology infamous, was original and pertinent. Preston S. Brooks only lived about 6 months after his assault on Sumner, and some of the abolitionists thought he died of a guilty conscience. Both in feature and expression he bore a decided likeness to J. Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Lincoln. It might have proved the death of Sumner, but for the devotion of his Boston physician, Dr. Marshall S. Perry, who went to him without waiting to be telegraphed for. It was also fortunate for him that his brother George, a very intelligent man, happened to be in America instead of Europe, where he lived the greater part of his life. The assault on Sumner strengthened the Republican Party, and secured his re-election to the Senate, but it produced nervous irritation of the brain and spinal cord, a disorder which can only be cured under favorable conditions, and even then is likely to return if the patient is exposed to a severe mental strain. Sumner's cure by Dr. Brown Secord was considered a remarkable one, and has a place in the history of medicine. The effect of bromide and ergot was then unknown, and the doctor made such good use of his cauterizing iron that on one occasion, at least, Sumner declared that he could not endure it any longer. Neither could he tell positively whether it was this treatment or the baths which he afterwards took at Aix-les-Bains that finally cured him. His own calm temperament and firmness of mind may have contributed to this as much as Dr. Brown Secord. When Sumner returned to Boston, early in 1860, all his friends went to drive S.G. Howe to know if he was really cured, and Howe said, "He is a well man, but he will never be able to make another 2 hours speech." Yet Sumner trained himself and tested his strength so carefully that in the following spring he delivered his oration on the barbarism of slavery, more than an hour in length, before the Senate, and in 1863 he made a speech 3 hours in length, a Herculean effort that has never been equaled, except by Hamilton's address before the Constitutional Convention of 1787. I remember Sumner in the summer of 1860 walking under my father's grape trellis, when the vines were in blossom, with his arms above his head, and saying, "This is like the south of France." To think of Europe, its art, history, and scenery, was his relaxation from the cares and excitement of politics, but there were many who did not understand this, and looked upon it as an affectation. Sumner in his least serious moments was often self-conscious, but never affected. He talked of himself as an innocent child talks. On all occasions he was thoroughly real and sincere, and he would sometimes be as much abashed by a genuine compliment as a maiden of 17. At the same time Sumner was so great a man that it was simply impossible to disguise it, and he made no attempt to do this. The principle that all men are created equal did not apply in his case. To realize this it was only necessary to see him and Senator Wilson together. Wilson was also a man of exceptional ability, and yet a stranger, who did not know him by sight, might have conversed with him on a railway train without suspecting that he was a member of the United States Senate, but this could not have happened in Sumner's case. Everyone stared at him as he walked the streets, and he could not help becoming conscious of this. That there were moments when he seemed to reflect with satisfaction on his past life his best friends could not deny, but the vanity that is born of a frivolous spirit was not in him. He was more like a Homeric hero than a Sir Philip Sidney, and considering the work he had to do it was better on the whole that he should be so. He carried the impracticable theory of social equality to an extent beyond that of most Americans, and yet he was frequently complained of for his reserved and aristocratic manners. The range of his acquaintance was the widest of any man of his time. It extended from Lord Brougham to J.B. Smith, the mulatto caterer of Boston, who, like many of his race, was a person of gentlemanly deportment, and was always treated by Sumner as a valued friend. As the champion of the colored race in the Senate this was diplomatically necessary, but to the rank and file of his own party he was less gracious. He had not grown up among them, but had entered politics at the top, so that even their faces were unfamiliar to him. The representatives of Massachusetts, who voted for him at the State House, were sometimes chagrined at the coldness of his recognition, a coldness that did not arise from lack of sympathy, but from ignorance of the individual. Before Sumner could treat a stranger in a friendly manner, he wished to know what sort of a person he had to deal with. There is a kind of insincerity in universal cordiality like that of the candidate who is seeking to obtain votes. A recent writer, who complains of Sumner's lack of graciousness, would do well to ask his conscience what the reason for it was. If he will drop the 3 last letters of his own name, the solution will be apparent to him. The more Sumner became absorbed in public affairs, the less he seemed to be suited to general society or general society to him. He was always ready to talk on those subjects that interested him, but in general conversation, in the pleasant give and take of wit and anecdote, he did not feel so much at home as he had in his Cambridge days. His thoughts were too serious, and the tendency of his mind was argumentative. Every man is to a certain extent the victim of his occupation, and the formalities of the Senate were ever tightening their grasp on Sumner's mode of life. One afternoon, as he was leaving Dr. Howe's garden at South Boston, the doctor's youngest daughter ran out from the house, and called to him, "Goodbye, Mr. Sumner." His back was already turned, but he faced about like an officer on parade, and said with formal gravity, "Good evening, child," so that Mrs. Howe could not avoid laughing at him. Yet Sumner was fond of children in his youth. L. Maria Child heard of this incident and made good use of it in one of her storybooks. The grand fact in Sumner's character, however, rests beyond dispute that he never aspired to the presidency. That lingering Washington malady which victimized Clay, Webster, Calhoun, Seward, Chase, Sherman, and Blaine, and made them appear almost like sinners in torment, never attacked Sumner. He had accepted office as a patriotic duty, and, like Washington, he was ready to resign it whenever his work would be done. Sumner's speech on the barbarism of slavery, timed as it was to meet the Baltimore Convention, was evidently intended to drive a wedge into the split between the Northern and Southern Democrats, but it also must have encouraged the secession movement. Sumner, however, can hardly be blamed for this, after the indignity he had suffered. That a high member of the government could have been assaulted with impunity in open day indicated a condition of affairs in the United States not unlike that of France at the time when Count Taliendal was judicially murdered by Louis XV. Washington City was an oligarchical despotism. A dark cloud hung over the Republic during the winter of 1860-61. The impending danger was that war would break out before Lincoln could be inaugurated. Such secrecy was observed by the Republican leaders that even Horace Greeley could not fathom their intentions. Late in December, John A. Andrew and George L. Stearns went to Washington to survey the ground for themselves, and the latter wrote to William Robinson, "The watchword is, keep quiet." He probably obtained this from Sumner, and it gives the key to the whole situation. It demolishes von Hoyst's finely spun melodramatic theory in regard to that period of our history, in which he finally compares the condition of the United States to a drowning man who sees lurid flames before his eyes. In the Republican and Union parties there were all shades of compromise sentiment, from those who were ready to sacrifice anything in order to prevent secession, to Abraham Lincoln, who was only willing to surrender the barren and unpopulated state of New Mexico to the slaveholders. Footnote: a not unreasonable proposition. But Sumner, Wade, Trumbull, Wilson, and King stood together like a rocky coast against which the successive waves of compromise dashed without effect. Von Hoyst was notified of this fact years before the last volume of his history was published, but he disregarded it evidently because it interfered with his favorite theory. The last of January, however, a report was circulated in Boston that Sumner had joined the compromisers for the sake of consistency with the peace principles which he had advocated in his 4th of July oration. Boston newspapers made the most of this, although it did not seem likely to Sumner's friends, and George L. Stearns finally wrote to him for permission to make a denial of it. Sumner first replied to him by telegraph saying, "I am against sending commissioners to treat of surrender by the North. Stand firm." Then he wrote him this memorable letter. Washington, 3d February, 61. My dear sir, there are but few who stand rooted, like the oak, against a storm. This is the nature of man. Let us be patient. My special trust is this: no possible compromise or concession will be of the least avail. Events are hastening which will supersede all such things. This will save us. But I like to see Massachusetts in this breaking up of the Union ever true. God keep her from playing the part of Judas or of Peter. You may all bend or cry pardon, I will not. Here I am, and I mean to stand firm to the last. God bless you. Ever yours, Charles Sumner. The handwriting of this letter is magnificent. Sumner had a strongly characteristic hand with something of artistic grace in it, too, but in this instance his writing seems like the external expression of the mood he was in when he wrote the letter. The question may be asked, why then did not Sumner rise in the Senate and make one of his telling speeches against compromise during that long, wearisome session? I think the answer will be found in the watchword, keep quiet. He perfectly understood the game that Seward was playing and he was too wise to interfere with it. Seward was the cat and compromise was the mouse. Whatever mistakes he may have afterwards made, Seward at this time showed a master hand. He encouraged compromise, but he must have been aware that the proposed constitutional amendment, which would forever have prevented legislation against slavery, would not have been confirmed by the northern states. He could easily count the legislatures that would reject it. It finally passed through Congress on the last night of the session by a single vote, and was ratified by only 3 states. As soon as Lincoln was inaugurated there was no more talk of compromise, and Seward was firmness itself. He declined to receive the disunion commissioners, footnote. At the same time he coquetted with them unofficially. He compelled the Secretary of War to reinforce Fort Pickens. He overhauled General Scott, who proved an impediment to vigorous military operations. These facts tell their own tale. After Seward and Chase had left the Senate, Sumner was facile princeps. Trumbull was a vigorous orator and a rough rider in debate, but he did not possess the store of legal knowledge and the vast fund of general information which Sumner could draw from. One has to read the 4th volume of Pierce's biography to realize the dimensions of Sumner's work during the period from 1861 to 1869. Military affairs he never interfered with, but he was chairman of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, the most important in the Senate, and in the direction of home politics he was second to none. No other voice was heard so often in the legislative halls at Washington, and none heard with more respect. A list of the bills that he introduced and carried through would fill a long column. The test of statesmanship is to change from the opposition to the leadership in a government, from critical to constructive politics. Carl Schurz was a fine orator and an effective speaker on the minority side, but he commenced life as a revolutionist and always remained one. If he had once attempted to introduce legislation, he would have shown his weakness, exactly where Sumner proved his strength. Froude says that to be great in politics is to recognize a popular movement, and to have the courage and address to lead it, but 3 times Sumner planted his standard away in advance of his party, and stood by it alone until his followers came up to him. He was always in advance of his party, but conspicuously so in regard to the abolition of slavery, the exposure of Andrew Johnson's perfidy, and the reconstruction of the rebellious states. We might add the annexation of San Domingo as a 4th, for I believe there are few thinking persons at present who do not feel grateful to him for having saved the country from that uncomfortable acquisition. The bill to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia was introduced by Wilson. Sumner did not like to be always proposing anti-slavery measures himself, and he wished Wilson to have the honor of it. Wilson would not, of course, have introduced the measure without consulting his colleague. Lincoln evidently desired to enjoy the sole honor of issuing the Emancipation Proclamation of 1862, and he deserved to have it, but Sumner thought it might safely have been done after the battles of Fort Donelson and Shiloh, and the victories of Foote and Farragut on the Mississippi, 6 months before it was issued, and he urged to have it done at that time. Whether his judgment was correct in this, it is impossible to decide. Early in July 1862, he introduced a bill in the Senate for the organization of the contrabands and other Negroes into regiments, a policy suggested by Hamilton in 1780, and no one can read President Lincoln's message to Congress in December 1864, without recognizing that it was only with the assistance of Negro troops that the Union was finally preserved. In spite of the continued differences between Sumner and Seward on American questions, they worked together like one man in regard to foreign politics. Sumner's experience in Europe and his knowledge of public men there was much more extensive than Seward's, and in this line he was of invaluable assistance to the Secretary of State. Lowell could make a holiday of 6 years at the court of St. James, but during the war it was a serious matter to be minister to England. In the summer of 1863 affairs there had reached a climax. The Alabama and Florida were scaring all American ships from the ocean, and 5 ironclad rams, built for the Confederate government, were nearly ready to put to sea from English ports. If this should happen, it seemed likely that they would succeed in raising the blockade. As a final resort, Lincoln and Seward sent word to Adams to threaten the British government with war unless the rams were detained. Meanwhile, it was necessary to brace up the American people to meet the possible emergency. On September 10, Sumner addressed an audience of 3,000 persons in Cooper Institute, New York, for 3 hours on the foreign relations of the United States, and there were few who left the hall before it was finished. He arraigned the British government for its inconsistency, its violation of international law, and its disregard of the rights of navigators. It was not only a heroic effort, but a self-sacrificing one, for Sumner knew that it would separate him forever from the larger number of his English friends. At the same time, Minister Adams had an equally difficult task before him. War with England seemed to be imminent. He held a long consultation with Benjamin Moran, the Secretary of Legation, and they finally concluded to see if an opinion could be obtained on the Confederate rams from an English legal authority. They went to Sir Robert Collier, one of the Lords of the Admiralty, and asked him if he was willing to give them an opinion. He replied that he considered the law above politics, and that he wished to do what was right. After investigating the subject, Collier made a written statement to the effect that the United States was wholly justified in demanding detention of the rams. Adams then placed this opinion together with Lincoln's notification before the British cabinet, but the papers were returned to him with a refusal of compliance. "There is nothing now," said Adams to Moran, "but for us to pack up and go home," but Moran replied, "Let us wait a little, while there is life there is hope," and the same evening Adams was notified that Her Majesty's government still had the subject under consideration. The rams proved a dead loss. When Benjamin Moran related this incident to the Philadelphia Hock Club after his return, he added, "We owe it to our Irish-American citizens as much as to the monitors that we did not suffer from English interference." Seward, and also Chase, wished to issue letters of reprisal to privateers to go in search of the Alabama, but Sumner opposed this in an able speech on the importance of maintaining a high standard of procedure for the good reputation of the country, and he carried his point. Sumner's greatest parliamentary feat was occasioned by Trumbull's introduction of a bill for the reconstruction of Louisiana in the winter of 1864. There were only 10,000 loyal white voters in the state, and nothing could be more imprudent or prejudicial than such a hasty attempt at reorganization of the rebellious South, before the war was fairly ended. It was like a man building an annex to one side of his house while the other side was on fire, yet it was known to be supported by Seward, and, as was alleged, also by Lincoln. It was thrust upon Congress at the last moment, evidently in order to prevent an extended debate, and Sumner turned this to his own advantage. For 2 days and nights his voice resounded through the Senate chamber, until, with the assistance of his faithful allies, Wade and Wilson, he succeeded in preventing the bill from being brought to a vote. It was an extreme instance of human endurance, without parallel before or since, and may possibly have shortened Sumner's life. 5 weeks later President Lincoln, in his last speech, made the significant proposition of universal amnesty combined with universal suffrage. Would that he could have lived to see the completion of his work. Something may be said here of Sumner's influence with Mrs. Lincoln. If Don Piatt is to be trusted, Mrs. Lincoln came to Washington with a strong feeling of antipathy toward Seward and those Eastern abolitionists. She was born in a slave state and had remained pro-slavery, a fact which did not trouble her husband because he did not allow it to trouble him. 15 months in Washington brought a decided change in her opinions, and Sumner would seem to have been instrumental in this conversion. It is well known that she preferred his society to that of others. She had studied French somewhat, and he encouraged her to talk it with him, which was looked upon, of course, as an affectation on both sides. At the time of General McClellan's removal, October 1862, Mrs. Lincoln was at the Parker House in Boston. Sumner called on her in the forenoon, and she said at once, "I suppose you have heard the news, and that you are glad of it." "So am I. Mr. Lincoln told me he expected to remove him before I left Washington." Sumner resembled Charles XII of Sweden in this: there is no evidence that he ever was in love. His devotion to the law in early life, surrounded as he was by interesting friends, may have been antagonistic to matrimony. The woman he ought to have married was the noble daughter of his old friend, Cornelius Felton, whom he often met, but whose worth he never recognized. The marriage which he contracted late in life was not based on enduring principles, and soon came to a grievous end. It was more like the marriages that princes make than a true Republican courtship. Sumner apparently wanted a handsome wife to preside at his dinner parties in Washington, but he chose her from among his opponents instead of from among his friends. Since there has been much foolish talk upon this subject, it may be well to state here that the true difficulty between Mr. and Mrs. Sumner was owing to the company which he invited to his house. She only wished to entertain fashionable people, but a large proportion of Sumner's friends could not be included within these narrow limits. As senator from Massachusetts, that would not do for him at all. This is the explanation that was given by Mrs. Sumner's brother, and it is without doubt the correct one, but women in such cases are apt to allege something different from the true reason. Sumner's most signal triumph happened on the occasion of President Johnson's first message to Congress in January 1865. He rose from his seat and characterized it as a whitewashing document. That day he stood alone, yet within 6 weeks every Republican senator was at his side. Sumner knew how to be silent as well as to talk. On one occasion he was making a speech in the Senate when he suddenly heard Schuyler Colfax behind him saying, "This is all very good, Sumner, but here I have the appropriation bills from the House, and the Democrats know nothing about them." Sumner instantly resumed his seat, and the bills were acted on without serious opposition. He would sometimes sit through a dinner at the Bird Club without saying very much, but if he once started on a subject that interested him, there was no limit to it. Sumner's speech on the Alabama claims was considered a failure because the administration did not afterwards support him, and it is true that no government would submit to a demand for adventitious damages so long as it could prevent this, but it was a far-reaching exposure of an unprincipled foreign policy, and this speech formed the groundwork for the Treaty of Washington and the Geneva Arbitration. It was a more important case than the settlement of the northeastern boundary. Sumner died the death of a hero. The administration of General Grant might well be called the recoil of the cannon. It was the reactionary effect of a great military movement on civil affairs. Sumner alone withstood the shock of it, and he fought against it for 4 years like a veteran on his last line of defense, feeling victory was no longer possible. Many of his friends found the current too strong for them, his own party deserted him, even the legislature of his own state turned against him in a senseless and irrational manner. Still his spirit was unconquerable, and he continued to face the storm as long as life was in him. It was a magnificent spectacle. It was the last battlefield of a veteran warrior, and although Sumner retired from it with a mortal wound, he had the satisfaction of winning a glorious victory. No end could have been more appropriate to such a life. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. Since Richard Coeur de Lion forgave Bertram de Gordon, who caused his death, there has never been a more magnanimous man than Charles Sumner. Once when L. Maria Child was anathematizing Preston S. Brooks in his presence, he said, "You should not blame him. It was slavery and not Brooks that struck me. If Brooks had been born and brought up in New England, he would no more have done the thing he did than Caleb Cushing would have done it, Cushing always being his type of a pro-slavery Yankee. In 1871 Charles W. Slack, the editor of the Boston Commonwealth, for whom Sumner had obtained a lucrative office, turned against his benefactor in order to save his position. When I spoke of this to Sumner, he said, "Well, it is human nature. Slack is growing old, and if he keeps his office for the next 6 years, he will have a competency. I have no doubt he feels grateful to me, and regrets the course he is taking." At the same time, he spoke sadly. Sumner resembled Lord Chatham more closely than any statesman of the 19th century. He carried his measures through by pure force of argument and clearness of foresight. From 1854 to 1874 it was his policy that prevailed in the councils of the nation. He succeeded where others failed. He defeated Franklin Pierce, Seward, Trumbull, Andrew Johnson, Hamilton, Fish, and even Lincoln, on the extradition of Mason and Slidell. He tied Johnson down, so that he could only move his tongue. In considering Sumner's oratory, we should bear in mind what Coleridge said to Alston, "The painter never judge a work of art by its defects." His sentences have not the classic purity of Webster's, and his delivery lacked the ease and elegance of Phillips and Everett. His style was often too florid, and his Latin quotations, though excellent in themselves, were not suited to the taste of his audiences. But Sumner was always strong and effective, and that is, after all, the main point. Like Webster, he possessed a logical mind, and the profound earnestness of his nature gave an equally profound conviction to his words. Besides this, Sumner possessed a heroic element, as Patrick Henry and James Otis possessed it. After Webster's death there was no American speaker who could hold an audience like him. Matthew Arnold, in his better days, said that Burke's oratory was too rich and overloaded. This is true, but it is equally true that Burke is the only orator of the 18th century that still continues to be read. He had a faulty delivery and an ungainly figure, but if he emptied the benches in the House of Commons he secured a larger audience in coming generations. The material of his speeches is of such a vital quality that it possesses a value wholly apart from the time and occasion of its delivery. Much the same is true of Sumner, who would have had decidedly the advantage of Burke so far as personal impressiveness is concerned. His Phi Beta Kappa address of 1845 is so rich in material that it is even more interesting to read now than when it was first delivered, and his remarks on Alston in that oration might be considered to advantage by every art critic in the country. It should always be remembered that a speech, like a play, is written not to be read, but to be acted, and those discourses which read so finely in the newspapers are not commonly the ones that sounded the best when they were delivered. Great men create great antagonisms. The antagonism which Lincoln excited was concentrated in Booth's pistol shot, and the Montagues and Capulets became reconciled over his beer, but the antagonism against Sumner still continues to smoke and smolder like the embers of a dying conflagration.